We all know the story of ancient Egypt, the mighty pharaohs, the pyramids and the Nile, but what if I told you some of Egypt's greatest rulers were black kings from the south, from Nubia, the kingdom of Kush? These forgotten pharaohs built dynasties, conquered Egypt, and shaped history in ways you've never been told. Their legacy was powerful, yet erased from most history books. This is the untold story of the Black Pharaohs who once ruled the Nile. Opening by the Nile. The Nile begins not with fanfare, but with quiet persistence, its waters threading through cataracts and deserts before unfurling into the fertile plains of the north. Imagine the soundscape: reeds whispering at the water's edge, ibis birds lifting from the marshes, and boats carved from papyrus sliding like shadows across the current. It is here, along these shifting banks, that the story of the forgotten Kushite Black Pharaohs takes root, a story that, for centuries, was drowned out by the louder chronicles of their Egyptian neighbours. The Nile was not merely a river, it was a stage, a corridor of life, a canvas on which both civilizations etched their dramas of conquest and survival. Mainstream historians often remind us that without the Nile, neither Egypt nor Nubia could have flourished. Its annual floods transformed barren earth into emerald fields, supporting populations and feeding armies. But what is less commonly told is that this same river connected two worlds, Egypt to the north and Kush to the south, in an uneasy dance of dependence, rivalry, and shared destiny. The river carried grain upstream and gold downstream, priests to temples and soldiers to battlefields. Each bend of its flow was as much a frontier as it was a bridge. The Kushite story begins in Nubia, a region often reduced to a footnote in world history, yet home to one of the most enduring civilizations of Africa. By the 2nd millennium BCE, Nubian kings already commanded respect, supplying Egypt with prized goods, incense, ivory, cattle, and, most critically, gold. The Egyptians even called Nubia Ta Seti, the land of the bow, admiring the deadly accuracy of Nubian archers. For Egyptian pharaohs, these southern warriors were both coveted allies and feared adversaries. One quirky fact lies in the way ancient Egyptians depicted Nubians in their art. While often stereotyped, in Egyptian wall paintings the representations are not uniformly hostile. Some show Nubians bringing gifts, others fighting as mercenaries in Egyptian armies. Still others are shown as bound captives, their bows snapped, their bodies humiliated beneath the feet of Egyptian kings. In this visual lexicon, Nubia occupied every role: trader, soldier, supplicant and foe, an ambiguity that foreshadows the dramatic reversal of fortunes centuries later, when Nubian kings would stand in Egypt as conquerors. Scholars still debate whether the Kushite rise was inevitable or accidental. Did centuries of interaction along the Nile gradually prepare Nubia to one day dominate its northern neighbour? Or was it the chaos of Egypt's political decline, the fragmentation of its local rulers, that opened a door Kushite kings simply stepped through? The answer remains elusive, but the Nile itself offers a metaphor, a current that seems steady on the surface, yet hides unpredictable eddies beneath. As the sun sets over the river in our imagination, the waters shift from blue to molten gold. This is the canvas onto which the Kushite Black Pharaohs will stride. They will be remembered not only for their audacious military campaigns, but for their spiritual convictions, their architectural revivals, and their deep conviction that they, too, were heirs to the gods of Egypt. Their dynasty will be one of resurgence and of tragedy, of victories celebrated and defeats erased. But before we follow them into temples and battlefields, we must first linger here by the Nile, this eternal witness, to understand how two worlds became entangled in one flowing story. Nubia before Egypt. Long before Egypt's pyramids rose from the desert, Nubia thrived as a landscape of resilience. This southern stretch of the Nile, carved between rocky cataracts and framed by dunes, was a crucible where survival demanded ingenuity. Here, villages clung to narrow strips of arable soil, herds of cattle grazed in valleys, and early chieftains measured their wealth in livestock and access to trade routes. To stand in Nubia thousands of years ago was to know both scarcity and abundance. Scarcity in arable land, abundance in mineral wealth. Chief among these was gold, pulled from veins in the desert hills. Egyptians would later covet this treasure so fiercely that Nub became synonymous with gold, and the land itself was named Nubia. Archaeological excavations at sites like Kerma reveal that Nubia was not a backwater, but an organized kingdom as early as 2500 BCE. The so-called Kerma culture left behind sprawling burial tumuli, mounds containing treasures, cattle sacrifices, and finely crafted pottery. These tumuli were monumental statements, announcing that power and prestige were very much alive in the south. A mainstream fact often cited is the scale of the western Defufa at Kerma, a mud brick structure larger than some Egyptian pyramids at its base. It speaks to a society with engineering skill, religious complexity, and political hierarchy rivaling its northern neighbours. Yet a quirky detail lingers in the pottery. Kerma artisans loved to polish their wares to a mirror-like black and red sheen, creating ceramics so refined that early archaeologists doubted Africans had made them at all. In the 19th century, some claimed they must be imports from Egypt or even farther afield. Only later did researchers concede that these were distinctly Nubian masterpieces, the fingerprints of a proud culture wrongly dismissed by colonial imagination. Nubia's relationship with Egypt was not static. It oscillated between hostility and cooperation. Egyptian pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom launched campaigns southward, erecting fortresses along the Second Cataract to control trade and intimidate local chiefs. But they also hired Nubians as mercenaries and celebrated their skill with the bow. This duality is telling. Egypt recognized in Nubia both a threat and an indispensable partner. Scholars still debate whether Nubia directly influenced the very birth of Egyptian civilization. Some argue that early dynastic kings borrowed iconography, burial practices, or even political structures from their southern neighbours. Others caution against overstating the case, noting that while Nubian and Egyptian cultures were intertwined, Egypt's unique geography may have fostered its statehood independently. The truth, as usual, likely lies in the middle. Nubia and Egypt shaped one another in ways subtle and profound, a two-way exchange along the river's flow. To picture Nubia before Egypt's domination is to imagine a confident kingdom, its warriors poised, its artisans skilled, its gold abundant. When Egyptian scribes wrote dismissively of the south, it was perhaps because they feared what lay there. In the flicker of desert fires and the clang of smiths' hammers, one can almost hear the distant foreshadowing of a dynasty yet to come, when Nubia would no longer bow to Egypt, but crown itself as Egypt's master. The two lands meet. As the Nile winds northward, it narrows through rocky gorges and then opens again into wide, fertile basins. Along these shifting landscapes, Nubia and Egypt faced one another like neighbouring households sharing the same street, close enough to hear each other's songs, yet wary of one another's ambitions. This borderland was not a hard wall, but a living membrane, porous to trade, migration, and cultural borrowing. Here, two lands met, Egypt, with its pharaonic grandeur, and Nubia, with its raw wealth of resources and warriors. A mainstream fact tells us that as early as the Old Kingdom, Egyptian officials made regular expeditions southward to obtain goods that Egypt could not produce itself. The records carved in tomb walls describe journeys to fetch incense, ebony, ivory, and above all, gold. These were not minor luxuries, but essentials for Egypt's political economy and religious ritual. Pharaohs needed gold to gild their temples, ivory to carve sacred figures, and exotic animals to parade as symbols of cosmic order. Without Nubia, Egypt's aura of eternal plenty would have been dimmed. Yet not all exchange was peaceful. The fortresses that still stand in ruins at Buhen and Semna remind us that Egypt invested enormous resources in policing the Nile's southern corridors. Soldiers patrolled mud-brick walls, watchtowers loomed over the river, and garrisons kept constant eyes on traffic moving up and down the water. These fortresses were less about excluding Nubians and more about monitoring them, taxing traders, extracting tribute, and reminding neighbours who claimed supremacy. One quirky tidbit comes from the graffiti left by Egyptian soldiers stationed at these forts. On the sandstone walls, some carved little boats, hunting scenes, or even crude jokes. Reminders that these were living outposts filled with ordinary men enduring long tours of duty in a land foreign to them. Their sketches capture moments of boredom and longing amid the tension of frontier life. To read them today is to hear voices of individuals otherwise lost in grand narratives. Scholars still debate whether this frontier was more often a site of conflict or cooperation. Some argue that Egypt's fortresses prove relentless hostility, a chokehold designed to dominate Nubia. Others counter that archaeological finds, like Nubian pottery in Egyptian households and Egyptian beads in Nubian graves, show vibrant two-way exchange. Perhaps the Nile's currents resisted simple categories. A merchant's boat might follow one day and an army the next. This duality shaped centuries of interaction. Nubians learned Egyptian hieroglyphs, borrowed gods like Amun, and intermarried with Egyptian elites. Egyptians, in turn, relied on Nubian soldiers, adopted Nubian cattle breeding practices, and admired the precision of Nubian archery. The boundary blurred, as boundaries often do when trade and necessity intertwine. To imagine these encounters, we might picture a dawn at the Second Cataract, traders hauling sacks of incense, Egyptian scribes tallying goods on papyrus, Nubian chiefs negotiating over cattle, and soldiers eyeing one another warily from the ramparts. Beneath the surface, however, something larger was stirring. The constant mingling of these two lands would one day give rise to a bold idea in Nubian minds. If Egypt could project power southward, why should Nubia not look northward in return? Rise of Kushite ambition. By the middle of the 8th century BCE, the balance of power along the Nile began to tilt. Egypt, once the unshakable kingdom of pyramids and eternal gods, had fractured into a patchwork of local rulers. Rival dynasties claimed legitimacy, priests held sway over temples, and the grandeur of the pharaohs seemed a distant memory. To the south, however, in the land of Kush, a different story was unfolding. Here, in the capital at Napata, a line of kings consolidated authority, drew strength from their resources, and gazed northward with eyes full of ambition. A mainstream fact anchors this moment. By around 750 BCE, King Alara is traditionally regarded as the first notable Kushite monarch to unify the Nubian lands. Though little is known about his reign, later inscriptions honour him as a founder figure, a man who gave stability to a kingdom poised for expansion. After him came Kashta, whose name fittingly means the Kushite. Kashta pushed beyond Napata, establishing control deep into Upper Egypt. At Thebes, he compelled the powerful priests of Amun to accept his authority. The stage was set for a dynasty that would claim Egypt itself. A quirky detail lies in the way Kashta expressed his dominance. Instead of smashing temples or humiliating rivals, he had his daughter, Ammonidis, installed as the god's wife of Amun, a religious office that carried enormous political weight. This clever act allowed him to weave his bloodline into Egypt's sacred hierarchy. It was a subtle form of conquest, achieved not with spears but with family ties and ritual. The maneuver shows how the Kushite kings understood the fabric of Egyptian power and were willing to play by its rules, at least at first. Scholars still debate whether the Kushites saw themselves as invaders or restorers. Were they outsiders imposing foreign rule on Egypt, or heirs reclaiming a share, tradition that had always flowed along the Nile? Some argue that the Kushite kings deliberately presented themselves as restorers of Egyptian greatness, reviving rituals and architectural styles long abandoned. Others suggest that Egypt's elites viewed them as usurpers, tolerated only because Egypt was too divided to resist. What seems clear is that the Kushites saw no contradiction in being both Nubian and Egyptian. They stood on a cultural frontier that blurred such lines. To imagine this rising ambition, picture Napata's sandstone cliffs glowing in the sunset. Priests of Amun chant in temples that mirror those of Thebes, while caravans carry Nubia's gold, cattle, and exotic goods. At court, messengers return from Egypt with news. Local princes bicker, cities stand unfortified, and temples hunger for patronage. For a Kushite king, this was less an opportunity than a calling. The gods themselves seemed to beckon northward, urging these rulers to cross the cataracts and claim the crown of Egypt. Soon, ambition would turn to action. Under Piye, Kashta's successor, this vision would become reality. But before we march alongside him into the Nile Valley, we must pause to understand that the rise of Kushite ambition was not a sudden spark. It was the product of centuries of contact, trade, rivalry, and imitation. By the 8th century BCE, the kings of Kush were no longer content to be the suppliers of Egypt's treasures. They were ready to be pharaohs in their own right. Piye's bold invasion. When Piye ascended the throne of Kush around 747 BCE, the Nile's currents carried more than water, they carried whispers of Egypt's decline. Fragmented by local warlords, Egypt had become a land of splintered loyalties. In the north, rival dynasties in the delta jostled for power. In the south, Thebes still held sway through its priests, but their authority was weakened by constant intrigue. It was a fractured land, vulnerable to any bold ruler who could offer unity. Piye, seated in Napata beneath the sandstone cliffs of Gebel Barkal, believed he was that ruler. Mainstream historians preserve one of Piye's most remarkable legacies, the Victory Stela of Piye, now in Cairo's Egyptian Museum. Carved in hieroglyphs, it chronicles his campaign into Egypt in meticulous detail. Unlike many rulers whose deeds are cloaked in myth, Piye left us a first-hand narrative. He records how he marshalled his forces, crossed the Nile, and marched into cities that had long been considered the heartland of Egyptian power. His words are confident, even serene, as though he were less a conqueror than a restorer of divine order. One quirky moment from the stela reveals Piye's disgust at Egyptian nobles, who, during surrender, served him poor food and stale bread. For Piye, this was not just bad hospitality, but a sign of moral decay. He prided himself on maintaining strict rituals of purity, including bathing frequently and observing vegetarian diets during campaigns. These personal details, unusual for royal inscriptions, give us a glimpse of a king whose self-image was bound not just to military might, but to religious discipline. Scholars still debate whether Piye truly intended to rule Egypt permanently, or whether his campaign was more symbolic, a grand gesture of dominance. Some argue that after subduing Egypt and securing loyalty from its rulers, he returned south, content to let local governors administer in his name. Others see his actions as the first deliberate step in establishing the 25th dynasty. The ambiguity lies in the way Piye withdrew without building a new administrative base in Egypt, preferring instead to maintain Napata as his spiritual and political centre. To picture the invasion, imagine long columns of Nubian archers, their bows strung tight, advancing alongside cavalry and war chariots. Egyptian towns fell one by one: Hermopolis, Heracleopolis, Memphis, until Pai stood at the gates of Egypt's mightiest cities. Each surrender was marked not only by military submission, but by religious recognition. Pai demanded that local rulers bow not just to his authority, but to Amun, the god of Thebes, whose worship had long linked Nubia and Egypt. When he finally returned to Napata, Pai did not drape himself in the spoils of war. Instead, he dedicated his victory to Amun, inscribing the stela as a testament to divine justice. To him, conquest was not simply about territory, it was about fulfilling a cosmic mandate. Egypt had lost its way, and the gods had chosen a Kushite to guide it back to order. Thus began the astonishing reversal of fortune. Egypt, the great civilizer of the Nile, now bowed to a ruler from the south. Pai's invasion was bold not only for its military scope, but for the audacity of its symbolism. A Nubian king had crossed the cataracts and proclaimed himself pharaoh. The story of the Black Pharaohs was no longer potential, it was reality, etched in stone for us to read nearly 3 millennia later. Conquering Memphis. When Pai's army reached Memphis, the ancient city stood like a jewel in the Nile Valley, a city of whitewashed walls and temples dedicated to Ptah, god of craftsmen and creation. Situated near the apex of the delta, Memphis was more than just a capital, it was the symbolic heart of Egypt. To control Memphis was to hold the keys to the two lands, for its temples anchored legitimacy and its palaces housed rulers whose names still resonated with authority. For centuries, no foreign army had dared to breach its gates. Now, a Kushite king from the far south prepared to do the unthinkable. Mainstream accounts from the Victory Stela describe Pai's assault with a mix of strategy and inevitability. The local rulers of Lower Egypt had rallied there, making Memphis their stronghold against the advancing Kushite tide. But Pai, with his archers and cavalry, encircled the city and cut off its supplies. After days of resistance, hunger and fear gnawed at Memphis's defenders. In the end, Pai's forces stormed the walls, overwhelming the defenders and forcing a surrender. The fall of Memphis was not just a military conquest, it was the climax of his audacious campaign. A quirky anecdote embedded in the stela tells us how Pai treated Memphis, not as spoils to be plundered, but as a sacred inheritance to be respected. He did not burn the temples or massacre the priests. Instead, he purified himself ritually and made offerings to Ptah. For Pai, this was not conquest for conquest's sake, but restoration of divine order. He even scolded Egyptian rulers who resisted him, declaring that they had failed their sacred duties, and that only through Amun's chosen could Egypt be made whole again. This fusion of military conquest with spiritual righteousness gave his campaign an almost missionary quality. Scholars still debate whether the fall of Memphis marked the true beginning of Kushite control over all Egypt, or whether Pai's authority remained tenuous. Some argue that his victory was largely symbolic, as many Delta rulers were allowed to remain in their posts so long as they swore allegiance to him. Others insist that the capture of Memphis proved that a Kushite king could wield genuine power in Egypt's political centre. The truth may lie in the middle. Pai ruled more through awe and religious legitimacy than through permanent administrative presence. Imagine the scene: smoke rising from breached gates, priests scrambling to save sacred statues, common people whispering in awe of dark-skinned warriors from the far south who now marched through their streets. The Nile itself seemed to carry the news downstream, telling every village and temple that Egypt's heartland had fallen. For those in Thebes, the victory was a vindication of Amun's will. For those in the delta, it was a humiliation that would never be forgotten. Yet Pai did not linger. Having secured Memphis and extracted oaths of loyalty, he returned to Napata, far from the Nile Delta's intrigues. This decision baffles historians. Why would a conqueror withdraw after such a triumph? Perhaps Pier understood that true control lay not in permanent garrisons but in spiritual legitimacy. He left Egypt's rulers in place, bound by the weight of his victory and the fear of divine reprisal. The capture of Memphis thus became a turning point in Nile history. Egypt, fractured and weakened, had been humbled by a southern power. The symbolic heart of the two lands had opened its gates to a Nubian king. Pier's victory was both a triumph and a prelude, for his successors would transform this symbolic conquest into a dynasty that ruled openly as pharaohs of Egypt. A dynasty proclaimed the dust of Pier's campaign had barely settled when the significance of his victories began to crystallize, though Pier himself returned to Napata, choosing the sanctity of Kush over the intrigue of Egypt's palaces. His actions had redrawn the political map. For the first time in centuries, the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt were linked under a ruler from Nubia. What began as a bold invasion matured into something more enduring, the proclamation of a new royal line, the 25th dynasty, the dynasty of the Black Pharaohs. Mainstream records affirm that Pier's successors embraced Egypt not as a temporary conquest, but as their rightful inheritance. Kashta, Pier's father, had planted the seeds by installing his daughter in Thebes. Pier had watered them with victory at Memphis. Now Shabaka, Pier's brother, would establish firm control over the two lands. Around 716 BCE, Shabaka is recorded as having united Egypt under his rule, moving the seat of power to Memphis and being recognized as pharaoh. The dynasty was no longer symbolic. It was real, and it wore the double crown. A quirky fact about Shabaka survives in a block of stone known as the Shabaka Stone, now housed in the British Museum. This inscribed slab preserves an ancient theological text, a kind of philosophical hymn to the god Ptah, which scholars believe may be one of the oldest surviving works of theology. Shabaka claimed he rescued it from decay, copying it from a worm-eaten papyrus. Whether true or a royal fabrication, the act reveals how seriously the Kushite kings took their role as cultural custodians. They were not just rulers with armies, they were restorers of Egypt's intellectual and spiritual heritage. Scholars still debate whether the Egyptians of the time embraced these Kushite rulers wholeheartedly or merely tolerated them. In Thebes, where devotion to Ammon ran deep, the Nubian kings likely enjoyed genuine support, for they presented themselves as pious restorers of the old order. In the Delta, however, their authority may have felt more like foreign dominance, especially among rival dynasties that had briefly tasted independence. Was the 25th dynasty a moment of revival or of occupation? Historians remain divided, reflecting the ambiguity of identity along the Nile. To imagine the proclamation of this dynasty, picture a coronation in Memphis. The city's temples resound with chants, priests lift sacred emblems, and Shabaka dons the red and white crowns that symbolize unity of the two lands. In Nubia, meanwhile, the sandstone cliffs of Gebel Barkal echo with the sound of drums as news spreads that a son of Kush now rules Egypt itself. Across both regions, people whisper of a remarkable inversion. The ancient master now bows to the ancient other. What the dynasty represented went beyond politics. It signalled a rebalancing of cultural flows along the Nile. For centuries, Egypt had cast its shadow southward, dominating Nubia militarily and spiritually. Now the current ran in reverse. Kush had not only defended its independence, it had claimed Egypt's throne and redefined what it meant to be pharaoh. This dynasty would endure less than a century, but in that short span it left monuments, revived rituals, and waged wars that etched themselves into the memory of two civilizations. In their proclamation, the Kushite kings declared that Egypt's story could not be told without Nubia, and for the first time the world had to listen. Shadows of Thebes. While Memphis served as the political seat of the Kushite dynasty, true legitimacy in Egypt could only be secured in Thebes. This southern city, ancient and holy, was the dwelling place of Amun, the god whose authority could make or break a pharaoh. Thebes was more than a city. It was a cosmic axis, a place where heaven touched earth, where priests commanded armies of scribes, and where the temple of Karnak stretched like a forest of stone columns. For the Kushite kings, claiming Thebes was not optional, it was essential. A mainstream fact underscores this centrality. Kashta, Paya's father, had already made inroads by installing his daughter, Amenertis I, as the god's wife of Amun. This religious office, a blend of spiritual authority and political power, carried enormous weight in Thebes. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy. By placing his daughter in this role, Kashta wove Kushite blood into Egypt's sacred fabric. Piye and Shabaka expanded upon this foundation, lavishing resources on Thebes' temples and aligning themselves with the priesthood that anchored Upper Egypt's identity. A quirky anecdote emerges from inscriptions describing the god's wife of Amun. Though technically celibate, she held estates, commanded temple revenues, and wielded authority rivaling that of kings. In some ways, she was the most powerful woman in Egypt. That a Kushite princess could sit in this office reveals the dynasty's brilliance in soft power. While soldiers captured cities, family ties captured hearts and rituals, it was as if Egypt itself had been rewritten to include Kushite bloodlines at its spiritual core. Scholars still debate whether the priesthood of Amun genuinely embraced their Nubian patrons, or whether they had little choice. On one hand, the Kushite kings were devout, funding festivals, restoring temples, and reviving rituals long neglected. On the There, their power was underpinned by armies and conquest. Was their devotion seen as sincere piety or as political theatre? The debate lingers as papyrus records and temple reliefs speak with voices both reverent and cautious. To imagine Thebes in this period is to walk through Karnak's hyperstyle hall, shafts of light piercing columns carved with hieroglyphs. Priests in white linen process through incense-filled courtyards, chanting hymns older than any dynasty alive. In the distance, the Nile gleams, carrying boats laden with offerings. Over all this presides a Kushite king, dark-skinned, broad-shouldered, draped in the regalia of Pharaoh, bowing not to his own ego, but to Amun, the god he believed had chosen him. It was in Thebes that the Kushite dynasty anchored its legitimacy, weaving together politics, religion, and identity. Without Thebes, their rule might have been dismissed as an episode of military occupation. With Thebes, they became restorers of Ma'at, the cosmic balance of truth, justice, and order. Here, in the city of shadows and sanctity, the Black Pharaohs claimed not only Egypt's throne, but its soul. Taharqa ascends. Among the Kushite rulers who held Egypt's throne, none would shine as brightly as Taharqa. Ascending in 690 BCE, he became not only the most celebrated king of the 25th dynasty, but also one of the most remarkable pharaohs of antiquity. Under his reign, the Black Pharaohs reached their zenith, presiding over an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean coast deep into the African interior. His name resounded from the temples of Thebes to the battlefields of the Near East, a name etched into both glory and struggle. A mainstream fact highlights his stature. Taharqa is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, specifically in the Book of Kings and the Book of Isaiah, as a ruler who marched to confront the Assyrians. This rare appearance of a Nubian king in biblical texts underscores the international weight of his reign. At a time when Egypt had long ceased to be a world power, Taharqa restored its place on the global stage. He was not merely a provincial pharaoh, but a figure entangled in the politics of empires. One quirky detail about Taharqa emerges in accounts of his youth. In a stela inscription, he recalls being elevated unexpectedly, chosen by divine will rather than by the simple order of succession. He claimed that Amun himself had singled him out while he was still young, tending to ordinary tasks, before suddenly raising him to the throne. This sense of divine election flavoured his reign with an aura of destiny. For Taharqa, he was not just another pharaoh, he was the pharaoh chosen against all odds. Scholars still debate whether Taharqa's achievements outweigh his failures. On one hand, he embarked on an ambitious building program, restoring temples at Karnak, Luxor, and elsewhere. He commissioned pyramids at Nuri in Nubia, and sponsored a renaissance of Egyptian culture that rivaled earlier golden ages. On the other hand, his reign was dominated by near-constant war with the Assyrian Empire, a foe whose ironclad armies tested Egypt's resilience. Was he a restorer of glory or a king whose ambition stretched his resources too thin? The verdict remains contested. To imagine Taharqa's world, picture him seated in Thebes during a festival of Amun. Priests chant, musicians play harps and sistrums, incense curls into the air, and the colossal statues of gods gleam under the sun. From this sacred seat, Taharqa sees not only Egypt's temples but the far horizons of empire. Phoenician ports along the Mediterranean, caravans of traders moving through Sinai, and Assyrian armies pressing from Mesopotamia. His decisions shape the fate of millions. Yet beyond politics, Taharqa left a lasting mark in stone. His restorations at Karnak included massive columns and new shrines. His pyramid at Nuri remains one of the largest in Nubia, its steep sides pointing defiantly toward the sky. In both Egypt and Kush, his memory endures as that of a king who believed he was chosen to bind two worlds into one. For a fleeting moment under Taharqa, the Black Pharaohs stood at the summit of power, the Nile glittering as their spine, the gods of two lands bowing to their rule. But as history often reminds us, every summit carries the shadow of descent. Temples and pyramids. If kings are remembered by their stones, then the Kushite pharaohs carved their memory in both Egypt and Nubia with a vigour few could ignore. Their building projects were not mere vanity. They were statements of legitimacy, revival, and faith. Through temples and pyramids, the 25th dynasty sought to demonstrate that it was not an interlude in Egyptian history, but a rebirth, guided by divine mandate. A mainstream fact demonstrates this ambition. Taharqa, Shabaka, and their successors embarked on extensive restoration projects across Egypt. At Karnak, Taharqa erected a colossal colonnade and new shrines for Amun. At Luxor, he added to the temple precincts. At Memphis, he sponsored repairs to sacred sites long neglected during Egypt's political fragmentation. The scale of their contributions rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, those of native Egyptian dynasties. For a land weary of decline, the stones themselves proclaimed renewal. A quirky detail appears in Nubia, where the Kushites revived the building of pyramids centuries after Egypt had abandoned the practice. At sites like El Kuru and Nuri, steep-sided pyramids rose over the tombs of Kushite kings and queens. Unlike the broad, flat-sided pyramids of Giza, these structures were narrower, their silhouettes sharper against the desert sky. Archaeologists once mocked them as copies or inferior imitations. Yet in sheer number they far outstripped Egypt's own. Over 200 pyramids still dot Nubia's sands, making Sudan, not Egypt, the land of the greatest pyramid fields. These monuments reveal a dynasty consciously tying itself to Egypt's ancient past while stamping its own unique identity. Scholars still debate the motivation behind this architectural revival. Did the Kushite kings genuinely believe they were restoring lost traditions, or were they using temples and pyramids as propaganda? To legitimize their reign. Some see the projects as sincere piety, evidence of rulers deeply devoted to Amun and the pantheon. Others view them as calculated performances designed to persuade Egyptian elites that these foreign pharaohs were heirs to an unbroken line of tradition. The ambiguity persists, for stone can proclaim faith and politics in the same breath. To walk among the pyramids of El Kuru is to feel this tension firsthand. Sand drifts against steep walls, the desert wind whistles through broken chapels, and yet the aura of royalty lingers. One can imagine the funeral of Pi, his body wrapped in linen, laid within a pyramid chamber as priests intoned hymns. In their architecture, the Kushite pharaohs sought not only to rule the present, but to command eternity. Meanwhile, in Egypt, ordinary citizens witnessed the resurgence of monumental works. Imagine the awe of a farmer from the Delta travelling to Thebes for a festival, gazing at towering new columns inscribed with the name of Taharqa. For him, the stones confirmed what rumour had already carried. The Black Pharaohs were not usurpers. They were builders, caretakers of gods, chosen restorers of cosmic order. Temples and pyramids gave the dynasty a dual presence. One foot planted in the spiritual heart of Egypt, the other in the ancestral soil of Nubia. Together they formed a bridge of stone across the centuries, linking two cultures in a shared vision of permanence. Even today, their silhouettes in Nubia's desert remind us that the Black Pharaohs did not vanish. They left their mark in rock, against which time itself has only partly triumphed. Wars with Assyria. No dynasty, however pious or ambitious, could remain untouched by the storms of its age. For the Kushite pharaohs, that storm came from the east, carried on the iron hooves and bronze-tipped spears of the Assyrian Empire. By the early 7th century BCE, Assyria was the world's most formidable military machine, stretching from Mesopotamia to the Levant. Its kings boasted of crushing enemies with battering rams, scattering populations, and exacting tribute from every corner of the known world. For Egypt, revived under the Black Pharaohs, Assyria was both a rival and an existential threat. A mainstream fact sets the stage. Taharqa, the great Kushite king, repeatedly clashed with Assyria under rulers like Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. The Assyrians had expanded into the Levant, subduing Phoenician cities and threatening Judah. Egypt, under Kushite leadership, positioned itself as protector of the region's smaller kingdoms, offering aid and alliances. Biblical texts even mention how Judah looked to Egypt, and specifically Taharqa, for salvation when Assyria loomed at its gates. These encounters were not distant skirmishes. They were global events that entangled 3 continents in a drama of empire. One quirky anecdote emerges from Assyrian royal inscriptions, where Esarhaddon describes his campaign into Egypt. He boasts of marching through deserts, overcoming thirst, and entering Egypt like a storm. In his accounts, he claims that Taharqa fled at the sight of Assyria's might. Yet Egyptian and biblical traditions present a different picture. A miraculous deliverance at Jerusalem, where Assyria's forces were struck by plague or divine intervention, sparing Judah. 2 empires, 1 event, 2 clashing versions of history. It is a reminder that ancient propaganda was as fierce as modern spin. Scholars still debate the true outcome of these wars. Did Taharqa genuinely hold Assyria at bay, preserving Egypt's independence for decades? Or did Assyria's repeated invasions ultimately break his power, forcing a retreat back into Nubia? Archaeological layers of destruction in Levantine cities hint at Assyria's ferocity, while temple inscriptions in Egypt speak defiantly of Kushite resilience. The full picture remains clouded, caught between triumphal stelae and bombastic cuneiform annals. To picture these conflicts, imagine Assyrian siege engines rumbling toward Egyptian strongholds, iron weapons glinting in the sun. Their armies, disciplined and brutal, clashed with Nubian archers whose arrows flew with deadly precision. the same archers once praised as the finest in the world. Along the Levantine coast, Egyptian allies trembled, their fate hinging on battles far from home. For Egypt's people, the wars must have felt like a constant rumble on the horizon, a reminder that their Black Pharaohs fought not only for glory, but for survival itself. In the end, the wars with Assyria defined the 25th dynasty's character. They were kings who prayed in Thebes and built pyramids in Nubia, yet they also stood on battlefields against the most ruthless empire of their time. Their struggle embodied both the height of ambition and the inevitability of limits. For though temples could proclaim eternity, Assyrian armies reminded the world that no dynasty, however devout, could stand forever without challenge. Memphis under siege. The clash between Kushite Egypt and Assyria did not remain confined to distant borderlands. It reached into Egypt's very heart, striking at Memphis, the city Pi had once taken in triumph. By the 670s BCE, Assyria's kings were no longer content to dominate the Levant. They marched west with overwhelming force, determined to bring Egypt itself under their shadow. Memphis, the jewel of the two lands, became the stage for this brutal encounter. A mainstream fact underscores the scale of the assault. In 671 BCE, Esarhaddon of Assyria invaded Egypt, with what chroniclers described as a massive army, boasting tens of thousands of infantry, cavalry, and siege engines. After fierce fighting, he captured Memphis, Egypt's ancient capital. The city's defences crumbled under Assyria's iron weapons and disciplined ranks. For the first time in centuries, Memphis fell not to an Egyptian rival, but to a foreign empire wielding the tools of a new military age. A quirky detail emerges from Assyrian annals. Esarhaddon claimed to have seized Taharka's family members in Memphis, parading them as captives in his triumphal display. Whether or not the story is true, it reflects Assyria's obsession with spectacle, humiliation as much a weapon as the sword. These accounts describe exotic treasures, Egyptian nobles in chains, and statues of gods carried off as trophies. To the Assyrian scribes, Memphis was not just a conquest, it was a theatre of domination to awe their own subjects back in Nineveh. Scholars still debate how decisive this capture truly was. Some argue that Esarhaddon's victory effectively ended Kushite control of Egypt, reducing Taharka to a fugitive. Others point out that Taharka regrouped in Thebes and later returned to Memphis, suggesting that Assyrian gains were temporary. Inscriptions from both sides tell conflicting tales. Assyria boasts of crushing victories, while Egyptian records speak of resilience and divine deliverance. The truth likely lies between. Memphis was battered, occupied, perhaps briefly lost, but the spirit of Kushite resistance was not extinguished. To imagine Memphis under siege, one must conjure the smoke of burning houses, the screams of civilians, and the thunder of battering rams against mud-brick walls. Statues topple, priests clutch sacred relics, and archers loose arrows from crumbling ramparts. In the chaos, Taharka withdraws, not broken but regrouping, preparing to reclaim what was lost. For the citizens, however, the trauma was indelible. The proud city, once the seat of kings, had been scarred by fire and foreign boots. The siege of Memphis revealed both the vulnerability and resilience of the 25th dynasty. It showed that the Black Pharaohs, for all their piety and building, were not invincible. Yet it also proved that they would not vanish at the first blow. Taharka and his successors clung fiercely to Thebes and Nubia, even as Assyria pressed harder. The fate of the dynasty hung in the balance, balanced precariously between faith in Amun's protection and the brute force of an empire whose chariots shook the earth. Retreat to Nubia. When the Assyrian tide swept deeper into Egypt, the Black Pharaohs faced a sobering choice: continue a costly fight for the delta, or retreat south to safeguard the heart of their kingdom. By the mid-7th century BCE, the once brilliant flame of the 25th dynasty flickered under relentless pressure. Memphis had been scarred by siege, Northern Egypt leaned toward Assyrian control, and even Thebes trembled. Yet in Nubia, beyond the cataracts, the dynasty's roots remained firm. It was here, in their ancestral homeland, that the kings of Kush found refuge, regrouping in the very soil that had nurtured their rise. A mainstream fact situates this turning point around 664 BCE, when Taharka's successor, Tutankhamun, attempted to reclaim Egypt. For a brief moment, his forces surged northward, retaking Memphis and rallying support in Thebes. But Assyria's power proved overwhelming. Ashurbanipal, Esarhaddon's successor, retaliated with ferocity, sacking Thebes in 663 BCE. The city's treasures were plundered, its temples desecrated, and its people scattered. For Egypt, it was a catastrophe. For the Kushite kings, it was a sign. Their time on Egypt's throne had ended. A quirky echo of this retreat lingers in the poetry of later inscriptions. Tutankhamun, despite losing Thebes, had his reign commemorated on the Dream Stela, where he recounts visions in which the gods promised him dominion over the two lands. The irony is striking. Even as Assyrian armies burned Thebes, the Stela projected an image of eternal legitimacy. This dissonance captures the dual reality of the Kushite pharaohs. In stone and ritual, they remained chosen rulers. In politics and war, their hold was slipping. Scholars still debate whether this retreat should be seen as failure or adaptation. Some argue that the Kushite dynasty collapsed under Assyrian pressure, reduced to irrelevance. Others insist that by retreating to Napata and later Meroe, the kings preserved their sovereignty for centuries, building a Nubian kingdom that outlasted Assyria itself. Was the withdrawal a defeat or a strategic recalibration? The argument endures, shaped by whether one defines power by holding Egypt or by sustaining Kushite identity. Picture the retreat. Long columns of warriors crossing the cataracts, priests carrying sacred emblems of Amun, women and children moving southward under the desert sun. Behind them, Thebes smoulders, its temples scarred. Ahead of them lies Napata, the sandstone cliffs of Gebel Barkal looming as silent guardians. In this retreat, there is both sorrow and resilience. Though Egypt was lost, Nubia endured, its kings still crowned, its gods still worshipped. Thus, the story of the Black Pharaohs shifted southward. No longer rulers of the two lands, they became guardians of their own, preserving traditions and adapting to new realities. The retreat was not an ending, but a transformation, one that would carry Kushite civilization into a new chapter, deeper into Africa, farther from Egypt's shadow, yet still within the eternal flow of the Nile. Kings of Meroe. As the Kushite pharaohs withdrew from Egypt, their centre of gravity shifted farther south. First, they ruled from Napata, beneath the sacred cliffs of Gebel Barkal. But over time, another city rose to prominence. Meroe, a settlement nestled near the sixth cataract of the Nile, surrounded by savanna, iron-rich hills, and routes that opened onto the Red Sea and the heart of Africa. From roughly the 6th century BCE, Meroe became the beating heart of a kingdom that would outlast Assyria, Persia, and even Greece. A mainstream fact establishes Meroe's longevity. For nearly 1,000 years it thrived as the capital of Kush, stretching from around 600 BCE until the 4th century CE. During this time, the Meroitic kings and queens commanded armies, minted coins, and erected pyramids in cemeteries larger than any Egypt ever boasted. When Rome gazed southward in the age of Augustus, it was Meroe that met them, not Egypt. The Black Pharaohs had shifted their throne, but their dynasty endured. A quirky glimpse into Meroe comes from its inscriptions. Unlike Napata, where hieroglyphs dominated, the rulers of Meroe developed their own script, the Meroitic alphabet, one of the world's earliest alphabets and still only partly understood. Its looping characters, carved into stone or inked on papyrus, whisper of a culture that consciously distinguished itself from Egypt while still drawing on pharaonic tradition. To this day, scholars puzzle over many of its words, leaving Meroe shrouded in linguistic mystery. Scholars still debate why the capital shifted from Napata to Meroe. Some point to practicality. Meroe lay closer to iron deposits and trade routes that connected Africa's interior with the Mediterranean world. Others suggest that the move represented a strategic withdrawal, placing the kingdom beyond the easy reach of northern invaders like Assyria or Persia. Was it economic foresight, military necessity, or both? The answer is elusive, though the outcome is clear. Meroe became one of antiquity's most resilient centres of power. To picture Meroe in its prime, imagine avenues lined with red brick palaces, markets humming with traders bringing ivory, incense, and leopard skins, and iron furnaces glowing in the night, their smoke rising like offerings to the sky. Pyramids dotted the desert outskirts, each a sharp silhouette against the horizon, smaller than Giza's, but far more numerous. Caravans trudged out toward the Red Sea, linking Meroe to ports where goods crossed from Africa to Arabia and India. In this blend of desert and savanna, isolation and connectivity, Meroe thrived as a bridge between worlds. The kings of Meroe styled themselves heirs of the Black Pharaohs, but they were more than echoes of Egypt. They were innovators, rulers of a kingdom with its own language, industry, and identity. Their story reminds us that while the 25th dynasty's chapter in Egypt was short, the dynasty of Kush itself stretched long and deep, carried forward on the southern winds of the Nile. Iron and trade. The rise of Meroe was not built on temples alone. Beneath its strength lay a foundation of iron and trade, two forces that transformed the kingdom into a powerhouse of its age. The land around Meroe was blessed with forests for charcoal and rich veins of iron ore in nearby hills. Unlike Egypt, which relied heavily on bronze until late, Meroe became a forge of innovation. Furnaces roared day and night, filling the air with smoke and hammering, turning the savannah into what some scholars call the Birmingham of Africa. A mainstream fact underscores this industrial might. Archaeologists have uncovered vast slag heaps around Meroe, evidence of large-scale iron production unmatched elsewhere in Africa at the time. Tools, weapons, and agricultural implements flowed from its furnaces, feeding both local prosperity and long-distance exchange. Iron gave Meroe an edge in farming, warfare, and commerce, sustaining its longevity long after Egypt's dynasties had faded. A quirky tidbit emerges in Greek and Roman accounts. Travellers described the Ethiopians, a term often applied to Nubians, as wielding iron weapons and commanding trade in ivory, gold, and exotic beasts. Roman markets marvelled at giraffes, rhinoceroses, and leopards brought from Meroe's trade routes. These animals were paraded in gladiatorial games, turning Kushite trade networks into spectacles for distant audiences. The same caravans that carried weapons and goods also carried wonder. Scholars still debate how far Meroe's trade routes stretched. Some argue that Meroitic caravans reached as far as India, through Red Sea ports and Arabian connections. Others believe the evidence is thinner, pointing instead to more regional networks, linking sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean. Did Kushite merchants stride across 3 continents, or were they primarily middlemen in African circuits? The Archer, eological record is incomplete, leaving room for speculation and ongoing discovery. To picture Meroe's trade, imagine camel caravans laden with salt, gold and ivory moving across sun-scorched plains. Boats laden with ebony and incense drift down the Nile. In bustling marketplaces, merchants haggle over leopard skins, while iron tools change hands with farmers who need sharper ploughs. From the savannas to the Red Sea, the lifeblood of Meroe pulsed through networks that connected forests, deserts, and oceans. This marriage of iron and trade made Meroe resilient. Even when Assyria collapsed, even when Persia and Greece rose and fell, Meroe endured, fueled by the steady rhythm of its furnaces and the flow of its caravans. It was not merely a shadow of Egypt, it was a kingdom with its own economic heartbeat. Through iron, the Black Pharaohs' descendants forged a legacy that glittered not in gold alone, but in the steel-like strength of innovation, queens called Kandaks. If Meroe's furnaces forged its strength, its throne was often shaped by remarkable women, known to the Greco-Roman world as Candace, a Greek rendering of the Meroitic royal title Kandake. These queens were more than consorts. They were sovereign rulers, commanders of armies, and symbols of Kushite resilience. In the long line of African monarchs, few figures shine as brightly as the Kandakes of Meroe. A mainstream fact situates them in world history. The Kandake Amanirenas, ruling at the end of the 1st century BCE, famously resisted Rome itself. When Augustus attempted to extend Roman rule south of Egypt, Amanirenas led armies into the frontier, capturing towns and clashing with Roman legions. Strabo, the Greek historian, describes how Roman soldiers faced a fierce, one-eyed queen who refused to bow. Eventually, a treaty was struck that allowed Kush to retain independence, a rare outcome for any state confronting Rome. A quirky anecdote adds texture to their legend. Classical writers were so struck by the image of powerful Nubian queens that Candace became a shorthand for all queens of Kush. The name entered Greek and Latin literature as though it were a personal name, when in reality it was a title like Pharaoh or Caesar. The misreading gave these queens an almost mythical aura in Mediterranean imagination, blurring lines between fact and legend. Scholars still debate how much real power the Kandakes wielded compared to their male counterparts. Were they co-rulers, regents, or truly independent monarchs? Archaeological evidence, such as inscriptions showing Kandaks leading armies or presiding over ceremonies, suggests their authority was genuine. Yet, as with many ancient societies, the balance of power within the court remains partly hidden. What is clear is that Kushite tradition left far more room for female sovereignty than most Conte, empery cultures startling outsiders like the Romans who struggled to comprehend women as warrior queens. To envision a Kandake, picture a royal woman draped in linen and jewels, standing before the pyramids of Meroe, a bow in her hand flanked by warriors. Behind her smoulder the iron furnaces, symbols of her kingdom's might. Before her kneel envoys bearing tribute from lands near and far. Her authority is carved in stone reliefs, where she towers over prisoners in the same stylized pose Egyptian pharaohs once claimed for themselves. The Kandakes embodied the spirit of Kush at its proudest. They were rulers who faced the most powerful empire of their age and did not flinch. They preserved independence through force of will and cunning diplomacy. In their reigns, the legacy of the Black Pharaohs continued, not as Egypt's imitators, but as sovereigns in their own right, guardians of a uniquely African throne, a blended culture. By the time Meroe flourished under kings and Kandaks, Kushite culture had become a tapestry woven from many threads. Egypt's influence remained visible, but it mingled with traditions from deeper Africa and innovations born in Meroe itself. Far from being mere imitators of pharaonic style, the Kushites crafted a culture that was both recognizable and original, a bridge between worlds that had once been separated by cataracts and desert. A mainstream fact is visible in the art and architecture of the era. Temples at Meroe and Napata retained Egyptian features, pylon gates, relief carvings of gods, hieroglyphic inscriptions, but alongside them appeared local motifs, lions, sun discs, and distinctly Nubian attire. Even the gods blended. Amun, long worshipped in Thebes and adopted in Kush, now shared altars with native deities like Apedemak, the lion-headed war god unique to Nubia. Reliefs show Apedemak standing proudly beside Amun as if the pantheons of North and South had shaken hands. A quirky reminder of this blending lies in burial practices. Kushite pyramids mimicked Egypt's ancient royal tombs, yet they were steeper, smaller, and often accompanied by chapels with vivid murals. Within them, rulers were buried with both Egyptian-style amulets and distinctly Nubian artifacts, such as cowrie shells or local pottery. The tombs thus read like bilingual texts, speaking in two cultural languages at once. Scholars still debate how consciously the Kushites curated this cultural blend. Some argue that they deliberately adopted Egyptian traditions to project legitimacy, while others insist that, by the Meroitic period, these practices had been thoroughly indigenized. Were they performing Egyptianness to impress their northern neighbors, or had Egyptian gods and rituals become genuinely Kushite over centuries of shared worship? The question remains open, to the evidence suggests a dynamic fusion rather than a simple borrowing. To imagine daily life in this blended world, one might walk through Meroe's markets. Traders speak in Nubian dialects, while scribes jot notes in Meroitic script, itself inspired by Egyptian hieroglyphs, but flowing with new characters. Priests chant hymns to Amun, while lion statues guard the temple of Apedemak. Farmers plough fields with iron tools, and artisans craft jewellery that mixes Egyptian lotus motifs with African geometric patterns. It is a city alive with cultural hybridity, its streets echoing with the sound of languages and the mingling of traditions. This cultural blend was not weakness, but strength. It allowed the Kushite kingdoms to survive long after Egypt's dynasties had faded. By rooting themselves in both Egyptian and African worlds, they forged an identity that could adapt, innovate, and endure. The Black Pharaohs had begun as conquerors of Egypt, but their descendants became something more complex, custodians of a civilization that straddled borders, blending traditions into a legacy uniquely their own. Forgotten pyramids of Nubia. When most of the world imagines pyramids, their minds turn instantly to Giza, the colossal tombs of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure rising against the Egyptian sky. Yet far to the south, in Nubia's desert, a far greater number of pyramids dot the sands. At El Kuru, Nuri, Gebel Barkal, and Meroe, more than 200 pyramids were raised by the kings and queens of Kush. They stand smaller, steeper, and less famous than Egypt's, yet they whisper of a royal tradition that carried pharaonic architecture into new lands. A mainstream fact underlines their significance. Taharqa, the most powerful Kushite pharaoh, was buried at Nuri beneath one of the largest Nubian pyramids, its base measuring over 50 meters. His successors continued this tradition for centuries, creating cemeteries that dwarf Egypt's in number. The landscape of Nubia is thus richer in pyramids than Egypt itself, even though few outside Sudan know this truth. A quirky anecdote emerges from early European encounters with these pyramids. In the 19th century, an Italian treasure hunter named Giuseppe Ferlini infamously dynamited the tops off several pyramids at Meroe in search of gold. He found jewellery, yes, but he also left the monuments scarred, their sharp tips blown into rubble. His looting horrified later archaeologists, but reflected the ignorance of an age that saw Nubia only as a curiosity, not as a cradle of kings. Scholars still debate why the Kushites revived pyramid building long after Egypt had abandoned it. Some argue it was a deliberate homage, a claim to the spiritual authority of the pharaohs of old. Others suggest that the pyramid form held symbolic power in Nubia itself, rooted in the sacred cliffs of Gebel Barkal, where the peak resembles a natural pyramid, Was the pyramid a borrowed tradition or a reborn one, reshaped by Nubian imagination? The answer remains uncertain, for the pyramids speak with silence as much as with stone. To stand among the pyramids of Meroe today is to feel both wonder and melancholy. Their steep sides rise from the sand like sentinels, some intact, others broken by time and looters. Camels wander between them, their shadows stretching across carvings of falcons, lotus flowers, and hieroglyphs. Tourists are few, yet the aura is immense. Unlike Giza, crowded and commercial, Nubia's pyramid fields feel almost secret, as though one has stumbled upon a forgotten kingdom. These pyramids testify to the enduring pride of the Kushite kings and queens. Even when driven from Egypt, they continued to build monuments that proclaimed their pharaonic dignity. They may not dominate textbooks or tourist brochures, but in sheer number and persistence, they outshine the pyramids of the north. The sands of Nubia, not just the plateau of Giza, hold the keys to humanity's pyramid age, myths and misreadings. For centuries, the story of the Kushite Black Pharaohs lay buried beneath layers of misunderstanding. When European explorers and colonial-era scholars first encountered the ruins of Nubia, they often dismissed them as imitations, pale shadows of Egypt's greatness. The pyramids of Meroe were called crude copies, the temples of Napata provincial, and the kings themselves foreign usurpers. Such myths, born of prejudice and ignorance, obscured the reality of a civilization that was both sophisticated and original. A mainstream fact reveals how deep this bias ran. Early Egyptologists, steeped in the racial theories of the 19th century, struggled to accept that black African kings could have ruled Egypt. Textbooks emphasized the purity of Egyptian civilization while treating Kushite achievements as derivative. It was only in the later 20th century that archaeologists and historians began to restore Nubia to its rightful place, recognizing the 25th dynasty as one of Egypt's most vibrant revivals. A quirky anecdote underscores the distortions of colonial imagination. In the 1820s, Giuseppe Ferlini, the same treasure hunter who dynamited pyramids at Meroe, returned to Europe with gold jewellery. When he tried to sell it, collectors dismissed it as fake, convinced that such exquisite craftsmanship could not have been made in Nubia. Ironically, the very artefacts he had destroyed monuments to retrieve were refused because they challenged entrenched prejudices about Africa. Today, those same pieces are recognized as masterpieces of Kushite art scattered across European museums. Scholars still debate how much these misreadings have permanently shaped public perception. Is Nubia still overshadowed by Egypt because of geography and scale, or because of centuries of neglect by scholars and storytellers? Some argue that the Black Pharaohs remain obscure because their monuments are less accessible and their script remains partly undeciphered. Others contend that their erasure was deliberate, a product of colonial hierarchies that preferred Africa's greatness to remain hidden. To confront these myths is to walk again among the ruins with new eyes. The steep pyramids, once dismissed as crude, reveal mathematical precision. The temples, adorned with both Egyptian and Nubian gods, speak of cultural blending rather than mimicry. The royal titles, inscribed in hieroglyphs and Meroitic script, proclaim authority that was neither borrowed nor stolen, but deeply rooted in local tradition. The tragedy of misreading lies not only in the damage it caused to Nubia's reputation, but in the stories we lost. For 2 centuries, schoolchildren learned of Egypt's golden dynasties, while the Black Pharaohs were reduced to footnotes or ignored altogether. Yet the stones have waited patiently, whispering their truths to those willing to listen. Myths and misreadings may have obscured them, but they did not erase them. The voices of Kush still echo, asking us to reconsider what greatness looks like and where it may be found. Rediscovery by archaeology. The veil that obscured Nubia's legacy began to lift in the 19th and 20th centuries as archaeologists turned their spades toward the deserts of Sudan. What had long been dismissed as ruins of lesser peoples revealed themselves to be the remains of a kingdom both powerful and enduring. Slowly, the story of the Black Pharaohs was pieced together, not from ancient chronicles alone, but from stones, pottery, and buried inscriptions waiting to speak. A mainstream fact illustrates this turning point. In the early 20th century, George Andrew Reisner, an American archaeologist, led systematic excavations at sites such as El Kuru and Nuri. He uncovered pyramids, royal burials, and inscriptions that traced the lineage of Kushite kings. Ironically, Reisner himself initially framed the dynasty as foreign usurpers, struggling to reconcile the evidence with his era's racial assumptions. Yet the material he unearthed, treasures, statues, and tombs, provided the very foundation for the modern recognition of the 25th dynasty's grandeur. A quirky twist in this rediscovery lies in how some of the most significant finds emerged not from careful excavation but from accidents. Local villagers, quarrying stone or digging for water, stumbled upon hidden tombs. In one case, a farmer unearthed a cache of inscribed blocks later identified as fragments of royal monuments. Such chance discoveries remind us that history often re-emerges in unpredictable ways, nudged into the light by everyday hands. Scholars still debate the ethics of these excavations. Many artifacts were removed to European and American museums, leaving Sudan with fragments while the bulk of its heritage sits abroad. Some argue that this dispersal helped preserve treasures during times of conflict, while others view it as another layer of colonial dispossession. Should Nubia's story be told primarily through galleries in Boston, London, and Berlin, or should its relics return to the desert sands from which they came? The question remains unresolved, a modern echo of ancient power struggles. To picture this rediscovery, imagine teams of archaeologists under scorching suns, tents pitched in the desert, and labourers hauling sand from crumbling pyramids. Photographs capture statues of kings with broad faces and powerful stances, their crowns unmistakably pharaonic, yet distinctively Nubian. Reliefs depicting the lion-headed god Apedamak emerge from buried temples. Each find rewrites a chapter once ignored, proving that Nubia was not a mere appendix to Egypt, but a civilization in its own right. Through archaeology, the silence of centuries began to break. Stone spoke of ambition, resilience, and artistry. Graves yielded not only gold, but stories of kings who had been forgotten, queens who had been erased, and pyramids that had been dismissed. The rediscovery was more than academic. It was an act of restoration, allowing the Black Pharaohs to rejoin the world's memory, modern Sudan's pride. Today, the story of the Kushite Black Pharaohs is no longer just the concern of archaeologists and historians. In Sudan, where the ruins of Napata and Meroe rise from the desert, these kings and queens have become emblems of national pride. Their pyramids appear on posters, stamps, and even banknotes, reminders that Sudan's history stretches back to one of Africa's most enduring civilizations. For a nation often overshadowed by Egypt to the north, the Kushite legacy offers a source of identity, resilience, and dignity. A mainstream fact highlights this revival. The pyramids of Meroe are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, formally recognized in 2011. They stand not only as archaeological treasures, but as symbols embraced by modern Sudanese culture. School children learn about Pie and Tahaka, the Kandakes appear in art, and tour guides proudly present Nubia's heritage as evidence that Sudan has as much claim to ancient grandeur as Egypt. A quirky glimpse of this pride can be seen in everyday imagery. Sudanese banknotes have featured the pyramids of Meroe, a quiet but powerful reminder of the country's ancient roots. In 2019, during popular uprisings, protesters sometimes carried images of kandakes as symbols of female leadership and national resilience. In such moments, the queens of Meroe ceased to be distant figures of stone and became living icons of struggle and hope. Scholars still debate how to balance national pride with archaeological accuracy. Some worry that modern retellings risk romanticizing or simplifying a complex past. Was the 25th dynasty truly a golden age, or was it one chapter among many? Should Kushite identity be framed as purely African, or as a hybrid civilization shaped by centuries of exchange with Egypt? These debates matter because history, once rediscovered, inevitably becomes part of politics, identity, and international narratives. To walk through modern Sudan with the past in mind is to feel echoes everywhere. Tourists ride camels among the Meroitic pyramids, while villagers nearby farm as their ancestors once did, pulling water from the Nile's banks. In Khartoum, the National Museum displays statues of Taharqa and Shabaka, their features striking and unmistakably African. Visitors pause before them, some with awe, others with recognition. Here stand kings whose memory belongs to Sudan, not just to distant scholars. In a world that long overlooked Nubia, Sudan has embraced its pharaohs as proof of its own enduring legacy. The Black Pharaohs are not relics but ancestors, their pyramids not ruins but monuments of pride. In their story, modern Sudan finds not only a link to antiquity but a declaration. Our history is deep, our heritage profound, our identity unbroken. DNA and debates. In recent decades, science has joined history and archaeology in exploring the legacy of the Kushite Black Pharaohs. Advances in genetics and bioarchaeology have allowed researchers to study ancient remains from Nubian and Egyptian tombs, seeking to uncover the biological roots of these rulers. Yet, as often happens when science meets identity, the results have raised as many questions as they have answered. A mainstream fact emerges from recent studies. Skeletal remains from Nubian cemeteries, including those near Napata and Meroe, show a diverse population shaped by centuries of interaction along the Nile corridor. Traits typical of sub-Saharan Africa blend with features more common in North Africa and the Levant. This matches the historical reality of a crossroads society, where trade, migration, and conquest blurred the boundaries of ethnicity and appearance. A quirky note comes from the sheer challenge of working in Nubian tombs. The dry heat and shifting sands preserve mummies differently than in Egypt, often leaving only fragments of tissue or brittle bone. In one case, researchers found that DNA samples were so degraded by heat that sequencing them was nearly impossible, leading to debates about whether conclusions could be drawn at all. These difficulties highlight the fragility of evidence in a land where time and climate are relentless. Scholars still debate what the genetics mean for identity. Some argue that DNA confirms what art and inscriptions already suggest. The Kushite pharaohs were African kings with connections that spanned the Nile Valley. Others caution against oversimplification, noting that genetics cannot capture culture, language, or self-identity. Was being Kushite defined by biology or by the rituals of Amun, the pyramids of Meroe, and the shared history of the Nile? The debate continues, reminding us that identity in antiquity was as fluid and contested as it is today. To imagine the process is to picture scientists hunched over microscopes in Khartoum or Cairo, tiny fragments of bone laid out on sterile trays. Computers hum as they process genetic sequences, while outside the ruins of pyramids stand under blazing sun. In one room, history is being rewritten by algorithms. In another, stone inscriptions still whisper their own stories. The two forms of evidence, genetic and cultural, intersect, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes clashing. What DNA and debates reveal most clearly is not a single answer, but a reminder of complexity. The Kushite Kings were part of a Nile Valley world that defies modern categories. They were Africans, certainly, but also heirs to Egyptian traditions, players in Mediterranean politics, and innovators in their own right. Their story resists neat labels because their world was anything but simple. In their bones and their monuments alike, the message endures. Identity is not a line in the sand, but a river, flowing, merging, and reshaping as it goes. Legends beyond Africa. The memory of Kush did not stay confined to the Nile Valley. It rippled outward, carried into distant lands by traders, travellers, and scribes who folded the Black Pharaohs into their own narratives. To the wider ancient world, Nubia was both a place of mystery and a source of power, a land of wealth and warriors at the edge of the known map. The echoes of its kings can still be traced in texts far removed from the deserts where they once ruled. A mainstream fact anchors this reach. The Hebrew Bible makes explicit mention of Egypt's Nubian rulers. In the Book of Isaiah and the Book of Kings, Taharka appears as the Ethiopian king who marched to confront the Assyrians. Though the details of the story remain debated, his presence in biblical tradition shows how deeply the events of the 25th dynasty reverberated beyond Africa. To the authors of Scripture, these Kushite kings were part of the divine drama shaping the fate of nations. A quirky glimpse comes from Greek accounts, where writers like Herodotus described Ethiopians, a term broadly used for peoples south of Egypt, as exceptionally tall, long-lived, and noble. Later legends embellished their realm as a land untouched by corruption, where the gods themselves chose to feast. Though fanciful, such tales hint at how Kushite lands captured the imagination of outsiders, less as a province of Egypt than as a kingdom in their own right, shrouded in awe and exoticism. Scholars still debate how much of these external references reflect historical reality versus myth-making. Was Taharka truly remembered as a great deliverer, or did biblical writers use him symbolically to dramatize their own struggles? Did Greek stories about perfect Ethiopians describe real encounters with Nubians, or were they moral fables projected onto distant lands? The uncertainty reveals how Kush occupied a liminal space in the ancient imagination, half historical, half legendary. To picture this broader reputation, one might imagine a caravan setting out from Meroe, laden with ivory and incense, reaching ports where Phoenician traders carried news across the Mediterranean. A Greek merchant hears of Nubian queens who rule in their own right. A Hebrew scribe hears of Taharka's armies clashing with Assyria. A Roman general hears of Kushite resistance on the frontier. Each retells the story, reshaping it to fit their worldview, until the Black Pharaohs become both real kings and legendary figures. Legends beyond Africa ensured that the Kushite dynasty was never entirely forgotten, even when their pyramids fell silent. They lived on in sacred texts, in travellers' tales, and in the imaginations of distant peoples. The Nile carried their names outward, scattering them across continents. Though the sands of Nubia tried to bury them, the wider world preserved echoes, half remembered and half mythic, ensuring that the legacy of the Black Pharaohs reached far beyond their own desert horizon. Why memory fades? Despite their triumphs, monuments, and far-flung legends, the Kushite Black Pharaohs slipped into obscurity for centuries. Unlike Egypt's golden dynasties, whose names were etched into global memory, the 25th dynasty lingered at the margins of history books. Their pyramids lay silent in Nubia's sands, their inscriptions half buried, their deeds overshadowed. How could rulers who once wore Egypt's double crown become so forgotten? A mainstream fact points to politics as the culprit. After Assyria forced the Kushites' retreat in the 7th century BCE, Egypt fell under successive waves of foreign rule. First Assyrians, then Persians, then Greeks and Romans. Each new power rewrote the past, emphasizing its own legitimacy while minimizing earlier rivals. The Kushites, remembered as outsiders, were convenient to erase. Their reign became a brief, uncomfortable interlude in Egyptian annals, brushed aside by chroniclers serving new masters. A quirky detail emerges in Egyptian art itself. Later dynasties sometimes depicted Nubians as servants, soldiers, or exotic foreigners, reinforcing stereotypes rather than celebrating the era when they had ruled as pharaohs. This visual shorthand endured for millennia, shaping how outsiders imagined Nubia, not as a land of kings, but as a reservoir of labour and warriors. Memory was managed not only by words, but by images. Scholars still debate whether the Kushites were forgotten deliberately or by accident. Some argue that their omission was purposeful, a political act to downplay a dynasty that reminded Egypt of vulnerability. Others suggest it was the simple consequence of geography. Their monuments lay far from the Nile Delta, inaccessible to Greek and Roman visitors who codified much of what we know about Egypt. Did memory fade because it was suppressed or because it was remote? Both explanations may hold truth. To pick. Cure this fading, imagine scrolls of history being copied in Alexandria under Greek rulers. The scribes prioritized dynasties native to the Delta or familiar to Mediterranean audiences. The Kushites, ruling from Thebes and Napata, seem distant, less relevant. Over time, their victories shrink to footnotes, their names garbled in translation, their pyramids left unvisited. The silence grows until only fragments remain, stelae half buried, legends half remembered. Yet memory is never fully lost. It waits, dormant in stone, ready for rediscovery. The Kushite dynasty may have been sidelined by later empires, but their monuments endure, reminding us that history is not what survives but what is chosen to be told. The fading of their memory was not a reflection of their insignificance, but of how power decides which stories matter. For the Black Pharaohs, that forgetting was temporary, for their stones and their pride still whisper across the desert wind. Legacy of the Nile Kings. The story of the Kushite Black Pharaohs stretches like the Nile itself, long, winding, and full of unexpected turns. From Kerma's early tumuli to Pia's conquest of Memphis, from Taharka's battles with Assyria to the Kandakes who defied Rome, the dynasty's path was marked by both triumph and tragedy. Though their reign in Egypt lasted less than a century, their influence rippled far beyond, leaving a legacy carved in stone, memory, and imagination. A mainstream fact captures this endurance. The pyramids of Nubia still rise today, numbering more than 200, a testament to centuries of royal continuity. They are smaller and steeper than those of Giza, but they stand in greater number, silent witnesses to a dynasty determined to prove its permanence. Alongside them, temples at Gebel Barkal, Napata and Meroe still bear the names of kings who once wore Egypt's double crown. A quirky glimpse of this legacy lives in modern popular culture. The story of the Black Pharaohs has inspired novels, documentaries, and even superhero lore. Their statues, with bold features and regal crowns, appear in exhibitions around the world, challenging long-held assumptions about Africa's place in antiquity. What was once dismissed as marginal now re-emerges as central, reshaping how we imagine the ancient world. Scholars still debate the ultimate meaning of their dynasty. Was it a brief occupation, remembered mainly for its wars with Assyria? Or was it a renaissance, a revival of Egyptian traditions infused with new vitality from Nubia? The answer may depend on where one stands. In Egypt, they are remembered as outsiders who briefly held sway. In Sudan, they are honoured as ancestral kings whose greatness was buried by prejudice and rediscovered by persistence. The debate itself is part of their living legacy, reminding us that history is not fixed but always untested. To envision their legacy is to stand at twilight in the pyramid fields of Meroe. The sun dips below the horizon, turning the sandstone red while the wind sweeps through the ruins. In the silence, one senses continuity, the voices of priests chanting in Thebes, the clang of iron at Meroe, the defiance of Candaces before Roman envoys. These echoes remind us that the Black Pharaohs were not anomalies, but essential threads in the fabric of Nile civilization. Their legacy is not only in what they built, but in what they symbolize: resilience, adaptation, and the refusal to be forgotten. The Nile has carried many dynasties, yet the Kushite Kings stand apart as rulers who inverted the usual order. Southern conquerors of the north, African pharaohs whose crowns gleamed in both Thebes and Memphis. They remind us that history flows in many directions, and that power can arise from margins as easily as from centers. In their story, we glimpse a truth larger than any empire, that greatness knows no single origin, but springs wherever people dare to imagine it. Conclusion. The Kushite Black Pharaohs remain one of antiquity's most remarkable dynasties, a chapter once erased, now rediscovered. Their reign fused Nubian vigour with Egyptian tradition, producing a cultural blend that reshaped the Nile Valley. Though Assyria forced their retreat, their kingdom thrived in Meroe for centuries, fueled by iron, trade, and the indomitable spirit of its queens. Their pyramids, more numerous than Egypt's, still pierce the desert sky, proclaiming that Nubia too was a land of kings. For modern Sudan, they are ancestors of pride. For the world, they are a reminder that Africa's history is vast and central, not peripheral. The Black Pharaohs challenge us to reconsider what we think we know about civilization, identity, and power. Forgotten once, they are forgotten no longer. Their stones still stand, their names still echo, and their legacy still flows like the Nile, eternal, resilient, and unforgettable. The story of the Kushite Black Pharaohs reminds us, history is much bigger than what we're usually told. If you believe these forgotten kings deserve to be remembered, share this video with someone who loves history as much as you do. And don't forget to subscribe, because here we reveal the untold stories, the hidden dynasties, and the powerful civilizations that shaped our world.